There have been various changes in general practice. There's stuff around the GMC and its judgments and how this may have impact in terms of future patient care. There's stuff around outages, IT in general practice, and the future of a really important company that has impact on every part of general practice going, as well as a few other news stories as well. And we're going to cover all that for you right now in the EGP Learning episode. So let's crack on and take enhance your primary care and learning. Hello, EGP learners. Welcome to this episode of EGP Learning, where we're going to be updating you on everything that's been happening in general practice, primary care, and a few other things that's been going on in this episode. Before we get cracking, how are we doing there, Andy?
Yeah, I'm good. It's quite exciting to be doing one of these news update episodes. It feels like it's been a while since we've done one of these. Spend a lot of time focusing on new policy documents for our live episodes in the recent past. So it's really nice to be doing one of these again and getting your opinion on what's been happening in GP news.
Definitely. And we've got some seriously large GP news going on and stuff. We're going to kick off with the biggest thing over the past week or so that's definitely impacted not only general practice, but almost every aspect of medicine in the UK. And it's a question that we're asking, given the judgments that have happened, and that's around the prospect, is the GMC actually still fit for purpose? Now, the reason we're asking this is there has been a recent case from the NPTS, so that's the group that basically assesses doctors and their kind of impact and stuff from the GMC. And it was a rather interesting judgment, wasn't it, Andy?
Yeah, it was interesting. So I guess we've been having a look at the Pulse article. It's been going around on Twitter, but obviously, it's a case. There are real people involved, so being sort of careful what we're saying. But we're really looking at the general sort of implications of the case. And my understanding, Gandhi, and you might have a different understanding, is that there was something that happened actually some years ago that led to a patient complaint where the patient has alleged that the GP did not conduct a physical examination. The doctor's documentation at the time, I don't think it was in general practice, it was in a different clinical environment. The doctor documented at the time that they did complete a physical examination. The patient has said that it didn't happen. This has led to a complaint that the doctor has incorrectly or dishonestly recorded information in the patient notes. So that's one side of it. This has the GMC taken patient testimony over the documentation that a doctor's made at the time in patient notes, which is really important. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the other aspect to this is that this doctor apologized for the distress caused by what had happened and been perceived by the patient, and that this was taken by the patient and then the GMC as an admission of guilt, which actually runs contrary to GMC guidance about managing complaints, which says actually an apology is not an admission of guilt and that this is something that is useful to do and that is helpful for patients. So there's quite a lot to pick apart there and quite worrying. Do you have anything else to say, Gandhi, about the incident itself that I haven't managed to convey?
No, so like you said, Andy, I mean, that's the basis of the actual complaint and the stuff itself. Now, we've not had a chance to go through the NPTS files themselves, so you can actually do so, and they are available in terms of the initial judgments and stuff. And I believe it's something like 46 pages. So apologies, EGP learners, we've not had a chance to go through that because of everything else that we're trying to cover today. But it sets out some of the kind of principles, the document. It's kind of like a transcript of a trial. So if any of you have been following things like obviously the Amber Heard, what's the name? Johnny Depp trial.
Johnny Depp.
And stuff.
Yeah,
it's kind of like reading the trial transcripts and that kind of stuff from that. But I know that there's stuff in there around, like you say, the examination process by the doctor, whether it did or didn't happen, and the NPTS, so the group that are judging this, have leaned more in favor of the patient's perspective of recollection that it didn't happen versus the documentation in the notes, which is a confusing and worrying element that documentation may not be felt to be appropriate, even though it's done live at the time. And obviously this is referencing an event that happened several years ago, which that's the only evidence often many of us have, because how many patients do we see on a daily basis? How if you go for a few years in advance, how much of that are you actually going to remember that one single interaction, unless it was truly memorable? But there is this bigger thing about the fact that the apology is being used by basically as a stick to say that it's an admission of guilt. Now, interestingly, there has been a development since the news story broke, hasn't there, Andy? So I guess it's
Yeah,
worth
so that's the
that
second.
stuff.
That's the second story. If we've got it queued up correctly, Gandhi, I'm not sure I've got that there queued up, but essentially there was a backtracking might not be the right word, but there was a change in position from the GMC. And tell us a bit more about that, Gandhi. I've not got the story on screen. But.
Yeah, I mean, so we've taken some of the stories from one of our friends of the channel, Pulse Today, and if you go to their page, it is, I think, the third or fourth one. But effectively, the GMC have admitted that actually apologising shouldn't be an admission of guilt, and that won't be used in future. Interestingly, they're not using it to reverse the current decision so far. Obviously, it's still an ongoing case, so whether that will change in the coming days or week, we don't know. But so far, they have said that in future that won't be an applicable thing in terms of using an apology as an admission of guilt. But it's still really worrying that that's happened, because it's now set a precedent in the case reviews and that kind of stuff that's happened. So it's going to be an evolving situation, and what this looks like moving forward, I think, is going to have real ramifications for everything. The indemnity organizations are all looking at this. I know there's been loads of chatter on Twitter and various other social media channels about this case. It has serious ramifications for how medicine will respond to patient complaints in the future. It's a bit crazy, to be honest, in that sense.
Yeah, I think the next time I'm responding to a complaint, I'll be having a good look at whether it's still advisable at that point in time to apologise, and how you construct that apology. And I'll be looking to MPS for a bit of guidance, I think, when I'm doing that. Yeah, it is a worrying development. It's also so. This is obviously a big thing, because we ended up talking about this in the practice clinical meeting. So something has to be quite a big deal to kind of make it sort of onto that agenda. It wasn't agendarized, but it was brought up by one of our salaried GPs, who actually said he has been through the transcripts, actually. And he often does that because one of his friends is an MPS lawyer. So he has a particular sort of route into these things. And he found it really, really interesting. And actually, he was more worried about this issue of patient testimony being given precedent over documentation, because often when something's happened many years ago, I mean, for us, the honest thing to say is actually, we may not remember that particular patient interaction. We cannot really go on our memory a lot of the time. We turn to our notes, which we make faithfully at the time, and that is what we rely on in terms of documenting what happened at the time. The patient's recollection has obviously been given precedent over that. Obviously we don't know the particular case, but patients, I guess, they have less interaction with the doctor. That's more of a special interaction for them in their day, in their week, in their year, often of more significance. So one might argue that may be more memorable for them. But equally, we know from a lot of work around memory that memory can be fallible, and around just other areas of legal work and recollection. So it's just a worrying area, really, because we often turn to our notes and our documentation as the way that we are defensive and demonstrate that we have done what is needed to avoid allegations of malpractice. And if that doesn't stand anymore, that's really, really worrying. Really interested to know what people out there, think. We've got a number of people watching. People may have some comments, on this, and if they've been discussing this issue with their teams.
Absolutely. No, I think if you are joining us live, or if you're watching us on the replay, even definitely in the comments, stick in your views on this case, because I think this is something that we may end up coming back to. Like I said, I think this case has and is going to have seismic ramifications for the way that complaints have happened across the board when it comes to medical healthcare, not just general practice. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens as this develops. So we may come back to this on the EGP Learning in a couple of weeks or so, once obviously more of the cases develop from there.
Yeah, and just another thing that came up in our discussion about this in our meeting was people were just wondering, are there other factors here? So it was discussed that this doctor may be an international medical graduate, and that often that can have an influence, potentially, some people say, on GMC outcomes, and I think it actually may bear through in some of the statistics around GMC outcomes as well. And also saying that sometimes there are things that are not clear even from the transcripts, and there may be other factors that have contributed to this. And an interesting discussion, not necessarily directed directly at this case, because I don't think this seems to be a factor, but we just had a discussion around actually the response to a complaint or a negative outcome can often be what gets people in more trouble than actually the incident that happened, which was interesting. A little bit thinking about the Philip Schofield issues. Sometimes the response is worse than the actual thing that may have happened. Obviously not directly related to this case, but it was just an interesting discussion. Sometimes they say, with politicians, it's not the crime that gets them, it's how they cover it up, that can lead to all sorts of allegations of probity. But I'm not making those allegations against this doctor, but that was just a very interesting discussion that we had.
Yeah. And I think if you would like us to have a look at this in more detail and possibly get somebody a bit more expert in to come and talk about it, absolutely stick that down so that we can look at that in the comments or something like that, because we do respond to our listeners and stuff, and we're coming to an example of that in a second. I guess just before we transfer over to that, a couple of resources I probably recommend people have a look at. So number one, another friend of the podcast, Dr. Rachel Morris, who does the You Are Not a Frog podcast, highly recommend. She's done a recent episode with one of the indemnity organizer lawyer people. I've forgotten which company, unfortunately, and it's about how to respond to complaints. And actually, it's something I've really taken on board, because having gone through a couple of processes for trainees and even for myself and stuff, it gives you a bit more perspective of how to respond to complaints. Really interesting on the whole comment that the first thing that she mentioned is apologize. So whether that will still be applicable advice now, we will find out. But the other thing as well, when it comes to documentation, many EGP learners know I try and help as many people as we can when it comes to documentation and stuff. Checking out tools that can help you do that, macro keypads, shortcuts, that kind of stuff. Absolutely make sure you're using these to help make your life easier. Definitely consider the transcription stuff. So did some recent episodes with companies around their digital dictation and transcription services and stuff. They can really be time saving and help in that side of things. And often the time to document is the thing that means that people don't document what they've done properly. And that can help you speed up the workflows and make life a little bit easier for you and things. So I think those are definitely some things I would recommend having a look at. I know that we talked about hearing from our EGP learners and stuff. So Andy, can we talk about the comment we've had from an EGP learner on that? It's probably good to say.
Yeah, so we're starting to get some of these come through now, which is really, really great. So first of all, thank you very much for all of those who kind of reach out, comment on things that that we put out on Twitter and other networks. And a few people have emailed us directly. We did the episode recently about feedback. I'm sure that can appear or be linked somewhere, or you can certainly search and find it, which was in response to somebody who reached out via email. And somebody else has reached out via email. So this is a practice manager from Nottingham, which is where we work. And it was an interesting email, really. So we'll just read it out because it's quite short. Hi, Andy and Gandhi. Thank you for your weekly podcast. It is very informative. I am not sure how you both manage to digest all the information and changes that we face on a weekly basis and then hold an informative podcast on the issues. So thank you very much for your comments, practice manager. I generally listen to the recording and say don't contribute to the live event. That's fine. That's a fine way to participate in EGP learning. There was one issue that I wanted to mention after this week's episode, and that was that you discussed upskilling the reception team to care navigators. My concern is that if we are being asked to upskill staff, it would be good if there was some funding to increase the pay to reflect this upskilling and not just the funded training. The role of receptionist is key, but the underfunding of practices, which is particularly an issue in deprived areas, means many receptionists are employed on minimum wage or very near it. The ARRS funding via the PSCE and DES is highlighting the disparity in terms and conditions between the ARRS staff and practice staff terms and conditions, and is increasingly becoming an issue. Best wishes. So that's interesting. So, and I don't know if I think we have talked about the issue of there potentially being in some areas the perception or feeling of a two-tier workforce between people who are employed directly by practices and people who are employed through the primary care network, DES, ARRS funding. And I was interested to know what you sort of thought about that, Gandhi, or if there's any I wasn't quite sure how to respond to this individual, other than say, yeah, and I think we've highlighted this issue before, and it's a difficult one to address, I guess. Any thoughts, Gandhi, initially?
I mean, it's a real challenge, isn't it? There is the absolute recognition from our perspective that general practice is underfunded to provide the services that it needs. And one clear example of that is in staffing. So actually what the EGP learner is talking about is the fact that the R's funding has bands that are aligned for Agenda for Change, which is what the rest of the NHS pays on, and often along the lines of trying to move towards Agenda for Change terms, which are very beneficial, which is one of the reasons why working within the NHS can be a really effective career and stuff. But I think the challenge that we've got in general practice, because general practice has to balance the books, it's a different funding mechanism for the rest of the entire healthcare system, that actually, like the EGP mentions, having the funding to pay reception staff, care navigators, that kind of stuff, it's just not there in the same way. And often how that works in terms of the mechanism is really harder to judge and understand. So therefore, there is becoming a growing disparity between practice-based roles and network-based roles, and different levels of funding that can be applied and that kind of stuff. And it is causing challenges from the recruitment perspective. I say that speaking as a PCN clinical director and as a partner. It is a real issue, and it's a growing issue. That's the problem, particularly highlighted by the cost of living increase that we're facing, and obviously the fact that general practice hasn't received any increases to manage the cost of living increase in terms of pay for staff and things. So it's becoming a widening gulf. And this references, I think, our episode talking about the contract changes, the fact that there's now funding for training for a care navigator from each individual practice and stuff. Emphasis, there's funding for the training, but no funding to actually pay the individuals to do the role. If they've been upskilled, there needs to be extra pay to enable them to do that. And that's, again, coming from the practice payment, which is, again, not being increased in compensation for that. So this is where the problem is. And we're seeing that because the output of that, unfortunately, is we're seeing more and more practices close because they are not becoming financially viable businesses. And that's a real problem that I think we're going to see. I predicted this back in our predictions episode, didn't we, Andy? And unfortunately,
it's coming through. You'd have been happy to be wrong, I think, on that prediction, Gandhi.
Absolutely.
I think you just to pick up on a few points you've made. I think you've actually outlined the issue really well there, Gandhi. The Agenda for Change is a great way of standardizing pay across the NHS. But I think traditionally general practice many general practice surgeries have not had their staff on Agenda for Change. And I think that's because actually Agenda for Change, the pay scales and the changes and the increases are set by the NHS at large. So as a GP practice, you do not have control over that if you link in contracts your pay and terms and conditions to Agenda for Change. So you don't have control of that. What you also don't have control of as a general practice is your level of funding relative to what you need to do with that funding, relative to the demand. You can't flex your funding up and down. And those two things together mean it can be really difficult to guarantee Agenda for Change. And I think a lot of practices try and match the changes, but actually pegging your contracts to Agenda for Change is really, really difficult. And, often when people are looking for a job, they want a contract that has Agenda for Change in it. So that's an issue. And also you mentioned about, and Helen mentioned about upskilling staff to do care navigation. And actually there probably becomes a point where you might need to look at that person's job description and scope of practice within their contract. They might be able to say, you haven't employed me as a care navigator, you've employed me as a receptionist, I can't do this. We have to look at the contract again. And that places you in a difficult position because if you're renegotiating the contract and expanding the scope of practice, then you're probably looking at a request for a pay rise. So it's really, really tricky. So just I guess stepping into that practice manager's shoes and saying, it's really, really tricky when you're actually having those conversations with staff. The other thing, Andy, and I might be sticking my neck out a little bit too far here, but I've spoken to receptionists, and often their experience of their job is that they are sort of sat tethered to a telephone that keeps ringing with angry patients, one after another, calling them, often abusing them, and it's very difficult for them to help patients. It can feel a bit demoralizing. There are other aspects of the job that I think are rewarding, and actually we've got a lot of receptionists doing it for a long time and they stick with it. So there's obviously something about the job that they do find rewarding, but their experience of it day to day is often, it's a bit like that. And they look at, say, a social prescriber who might have a similar skill set to them, or at least coming from a similar starting point, and they see someone who is, supporting someone by taking them, to a visit somewhere, or doing something which potentially looks and feels a bit more rewarding and helping someone in a more direct way, and they think, why am I paid less, or why am I not paid more? So I think there is that tension that's developing there as well, just in terms of the content of the job. So Helen's done a really good job of outlining the problem, as have we, but
I think there's also a comment that's worth
solutions?
highlighting as well. So from a Facebook user, because they haven't put their name in, fair enough. Another challenge is the rise in minimum wage, which has narrowed the pay differential between roles and practices as well. And I know that's a concern for many practices when the increase in minimum wage came in, how to fund that and what level to go to, because it's trying to absolutely pay our staff appropriately. However, when the funding that you're given doesn't allow for that to be a really fair mechanism and doesn't incorporate the increases in cost of living as well, that's the key thing it hasn't done in general practice, then that's a real challenge to manage. But I know many practices are trying their best to pay their staff more, because quite appropriately they do amazing work, especially our reception teams, our care navigators and stuff. But it's a continuing problem of cash flow, which unfortunately is an ongoing issue in general practice and stuff.
Yeah.
So really interesting topics there. So we've talked about obviously the GMC stuff. We've talked about the comments from our EGP learners and absolutely sticking things and stuff. And yeah, hi Dustin. So just to mention, Facebook user is another friend of the channel, Dustin Saint, from Primary Care IT, which we've got some amazing stuff coming from him in towards the end of June as well. So definitely keep your eyes out from that if you're a tech head and things. But next we're going to talk about a tech thing, actually. So EMIS had a major outage last week. And this was really significant. And it's so significant, it even hit the national headlines, which is unusual for a general practice story, unless it's about access. So Andy, do you want to take us through this at all?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm not an EMIS practice. I don't believe you are an EMIS practice either. So thankfully, we weren't directly affected. And my understanding is that the EMIS service was not available for a number of hours on a Friday afternoon, and that obviously for those GP practices and for those other services that use EMIS, that's that means that they can't use their IT systems, and that has all sorts of impacts in terms of how much capacity they can handle, how quickly they can get through work, and how safely they can care for people, because having access to the complete medical record is really, really helpful in terms of dealing with people appropriately, but also in terms of dealing with them safely. I think a lot of practitioners, and I think probably for all of us, it is possible to change how you practice so that you can be safe. There will be a number of things that you won't be able to do, but at least you can provide basic care. So I don't think there's a question of being completely unsafe, but it really limits the scope of what you're able to do effectively. I mean, that's my understanding. There's all sorts of implications for this and things to talk to. Do you have anything to say about the issue or the incident itself, Gandhi?
So I think the challenge for many people was, obviously, like you said, this was a Friday, a Friday before a bank holiday. So that inevitably meant that it was a busier period than normal for many people. And as a result of that, the stress that this caused, and it was for several hours in some places. Now, the really confusing part as well, it wasn't just all EMIS practices, it was some EMIS practices. And I know since then, the EMIS company have put out some information about the fact it was to do with an update they did with a particular part of the systems that they use, and unfortunately that caused an issue and then had a trigger issue and that basically caused the whole system to crash, which inevitably is the way that a lot of these tech things happen. It comes down to updates, and we've seen that not just with general practice IT, but with all types of IT, isn't it? Inevitably, when it comes to systems crashing, it's because something's changed in the back end and it's had an unintended consequence, and that's had an impact on the user experience. Like you mentioned, the stress this has caused for many people, it was bonkers. It really was, watching the WhatsApp groups, watching the Facebook groups and stuff, just literally whoosh, with all the people, the struggles they were having to deal with, the complaints, the risks that they were having to manage. Without the IT systems, we have virtually no access to patient information. So what medications those patients may be taking, what health issues they have, things like if you've got a patient coming in for a review of results, you don't have access to the results to go through that. You just don't have that information, and for the expectation for clinicians to know all that is unrealistic. And because it's not kept in paper format nowadays, there's no real other way of accessing it as well. So if you don't have access to the system, you can't do anything to help that. Yes, you can do the basics, you can do the emergency care, you can deal with immediate issues possibly, but then again, that may have an impact in terms of, can you check allergies on a patient if you're prescribing something? Maybe not.
Got to ask them.
Yeah, you got to ask them. And if they don't
They've
know,
got to know. Yeah.
Then that's, and some people say, well, how can a patient not know? Actually, how many times have you taken a pill and said, I don't know what medication this is? How many times have you forgotten parts of your own healthcare because that's a complicated journey?
I'm allergic to an antibiotic, but I can't remember which one.
Exactly.
People often have incomplete recollection. So it's really, really disruptive, isn't it? I'm glad that things got back up and running. This got me thinking about general reliance on technology. We are so reliant on these systems. It is so important that we have robust systems, and it got me thinking about challenges, I guess, that we've had with technology in our surgery over the years. We're in a fairly new building, like yourself. There was a period of time when we would lose internet connection. This is just in the last few years, at our building, at least a number of times a year, and at worst for a few days at a time. That had a big impact on us. I guess it's just one practice in isolation, so that is different to if it's happening to multiple practices or services at the same time, which can have a bigger systemic impact. At least we can send people elsewhere if we cannot cope with them safely because other parts of the system are not affected in the same way that we are. Also got me thinking about the Ad Astra issues that happened with the system that a lot of out of hours and paramedic services use recently, and that was really disruptive. Got me thinking about the cyber attack as well. You probably remember this, but when huge parts of the country, hospitals and GP practices and all other parts of the NHS completely lost access to their clinical systems and often access to the internet entirely. Often a number of the telephone systems went down locally as well. This was as people realized that the spread of the virus was getting out of control, and they pulled the plug on a lot of services to stop the spread and the corruption of data, and it took a number of days for that to get back up and running. And finally, this chain of thought led me to, how do people cope when their systems go down? Because there were a number of lessons that we learned that I think are still in our drawer to get out, if and when our systems go down next time. But did you draw any lessons from this before we maybe talk about those things that we do and can do as practices to be a bit more resilient when this happens?
Well, I think, like you say, you need to have a plan. So there should be something in the business continuity plan of the practice, what to do if your system goes down, because it's a distinct reality. As you mentioned, it's happened in the past, to pretty much every practice going, I would imagine, for some reason or another. And definitely the WannaCry hack was the biggest nationally impacting one that we've had for a while. Similar to yourself, our IT goes down on an occasion. We've got into the habit of knowing the processes to manage that for a short period of time. But when that becomes an extended period of time, that's when the stress really, really builds up. Let's be honest, it still builds up anyway, because you are automatically behind by up to potentially a couple of hours. So even going without your IT system for half an hour can set the practice team back by about 2 hours in terms of work that they then have to do on catch up. And as a result of that, so it's important to know the significant impact a short period of time without IT services can have on the provision of healthcare. I think in terms of how you manage that, there are definitely processes you can look at. I mean, I don't know what yours are, Andy, but ours is very much, if somebody's got access to a system, just grab, screen grab of it, print it off as quickly as you can if you can. So you've got lists of patients, because that's the key thing, who's coming in. Often we will put some information out onto our practice websites, to mention that we have changes in the system and try and change the phone message if it's a significant problem. And just going out into the waiting area and keeping patients up to date. So often I'll be the person that goes out into the waiting area and say, I'm really sorry, we're having an IT issue. It does mean we don't have access to the records. We will help you as quickly as we can, but there will be a delay, and making it very clear that things have changed. And if that's a problem, please let our reception team know, and we can try our best to accommodate what we can. But to be clear, we don't have access to any patient records at this time. I've had to do that numerous times, which is frustrating.
Yeah. I think we have similar processes. I'm just thinking what's in our business continuity plan, because we did sit down and really look at this after the WannaCry NHS cyber attack issue. So yeah, I think it almost feels like there's an acronym to be created here. But I think so. There's something about planning. So now we still have some of the books. Should we get rid of all our reference books? And we decided, no, actually, because these can be valuable if the internet goes down completely or there's a power outage. So I've still got Oxford Handbook of General Practice. I've kept my reference materials in my drawer. And we've got, our BNFs around, and we keep those up to date, because actually access to information can be an issue if your information systems on the internet or telecoms go down. So I was plan ahead, and the team know what to do as well. Grab or backup information. So we're supposed to back up who's coming the next day, the night before. And I believe that does happen, because when things go down, people seem to know who's coming. So it's great the system's working at my practice. But yeah, just grabbing what information you can from those things that are still active. Sometimes it's actually like the fixed internet, and actually people can still hotspot on the laptops that we have for home working. So sometimes we can provide like a partial system using our laptops and using a different way to access the internet. So, be agile and think about workarounds. And then actually, when push comes to shove, we've got some templates for consultations that we keep, that we can get out of the drawer to allow, reasonable documentation of what has happened for each patient, with collection of the patient demographics, so that we can then get that back on the system afterwards, and catch up any tasks that we need to do as a result of consultations afterwards. Because that's helpful, because sometimes what to do. You've been a partner there for a while, you've experienced this before, but you might have a locum in the building who doesn't know what to do, and actually handing them a template and giving them a clear plan of what the expectations are when this happened can be really, really helpful. So yes, I think probably we should all just pause and think, and what would we do if this happened to us, and do we have a plan in our practice to continue to be safe and effective in the event that our clinical record system or some other IT or infrastructure system goes down.
And I guess one of the things to for all of our EGP learners listening and watching this to note, I think there's absolutely the aspect of disaster planning for when you don't have access to IT or the systems that drive the IT and stuff. I think one of the reasons why this has become a bit of an issue, and very much within the GP community became more of a concern, is unfortunately this isn't the first time this has happened with EMIS system itself. And on such a large scale. So unfortunately, I know that hearing and watching some of the groups, this seems to be becoming a recurring issue. And there is, I guess, from my perspective, a growing concern around how EMIS is managing to upkeep its systems and stuff. And are they listening to the users or not? Some of this may be founded in obviously their reach and purchase, which we covered earlier on the channel and stuff. I'll be clear, that's not to say that System 1 is perfect, although absolute declaration, obviously I run the System 1 Facebook group, the community and stuff for them, so obviously have some connections and allegiance there in that sense and things. But I think one of the things I would mention to many people is that no IT system is perfect. We are supposed to be getting some new IT systems in general practice in the near future. It'd be really interesting to see how those players manage things, because obviously IT continuance is the key thing. May even speak to cloud-based telephony. What happens if that goes down? How does that affect practices? Because obviously that's sold as the big thing to save general practice according to the government. That's what they're investing in, not staff. It's about the tech and the phone systems and things. But I think there are other factors around this has caused a lot of emotion from the GP community itself, and it'd be really interesting to see how that plans out in the coming weeks and months and stuff. Because again, this isn't the first time this has happened, and I don't think it's going to be the last either, unfortunately, which is a real problem.
No. So make sure there's a plan in place, and that involves not just us as practices, but systems and government as well.
So I guess moving on, we've had another news story that's I think future looking a little bit, but something I think will interest many people working in general practice. And this is the possibility that PSCE may not longer exist. Andy, do you want to talk us through it?
PSCE, so Primary Care Support England. So this is the organisation that run a lot of the I'm not sure if back office is the right term, but background services that actually are essential for general practice to run. So it's managing, payment for some work and contracts. It's managing our pension scheme, which is
Yeah,
really important
big one.
To staff, not just GPs, but everyone's pension scheme. There's just all sorts of back office functions, and people are sometimes critical of how they function. They can make mistakes. They can take a long time to clear up issues and get back to you about things. I know I've had difficulty sorting out queries around my pension with them myself, and I know lots of colleagues that have as well. And they're also often linked with the name Capita, I think, who I'm not sure, do Capita run all of PSCE's functions, or is it
From
just
my
some of
knowledge,
them
they
again?
do. PSCE is now completely run by Capita. Yeah.
Yeah. So Capita are one of these sort of big multinational organizations that provide a lot of back office functions. So you can kind of contract them to come in and run all sorts of functions for your organization, and they will get it done. You can contract to them, so you don't have to employ the staff that deliver it themselves and have all of the, liabilities and training requirements, that are needed. You set your service test specifications as a government department or a large company, and a firm like Capita will come in and they will run those functions for you, and that's what they do for PSCE. So the suggestion is that PSCE's functions might be split. So can you tell me a bit more about that, Gandhi? Are they going to split in two, multiple pieces, or is it just the concept that they're breaking them up? Why?
Well, I think it's more to do with the concept. So there's no clear definition as to what the plan is at this point. I think the reason for this is, well, first of all, the contract's up for renewal in 2025. And it is a major contract. Like you said, it's the back office functions for not only general practice, but a lot of the NHS, including the pensions. And absolutely, there has been some concern around the way that has been run over the past few years. Many people will remember the issues that people have had and still continue to have in terms of getting appropriate pension information. And that now affects all of healthcare, not just general practice. Originally, it was just general practice, but then even hospital-based doctors are now involved in this, as well as the rest of the NHS and things. Some people may remember the issues of notes transfers when the PSCE first took over. And that notes weren't being transferred across to practices in appropriate timeframes, being lost. That had huge implications about knowledge of the patients. And we just talked about the impact that can have from an IT system perspective. But if you don't have the notes transfers themselves happening, potentially for weeks, that can have a real issue in terms of how you can then manage the healthcare of an individual patient and stuff. So, there are various other things. Stationery was PSCE's issue, domain. So prescription pads, Med3s, when we used to use Med3s in paper format more so. Obviously, a lot of that's now moved to electronics. That's less of an issue. But these are all things within the domain functions. And it seems like the trajectory is that maybe the contract itself will be split into different functions. So maybe we'll have a separate contract for pensions, a separate one for stationery, a separate one for notes transfers. We don't know is the key thing, but it's a suggestion that's being made. And I think it's a suggestion many people are happy with. And many people are calling for Capita not to be allowed to bid for the contract as well, because of the way it's been handled. Now, there are various different arguments as to how it's been handled. Some people would say that Capita were not given enough funding to manage the system because it was massively cut down in terms of the amount of funding that were given from the original contracts way back when. We're talking over 10 years ago that this contract's been running. Some people say it's what you get when you ask private companies to come and do public health services, actually, that their emphasis is on making a profit. And obviously that can have a detriment to the way the service is run. Depends where you sit on that line. There is absolutely some history here that Capita have not done what they could have done, or some would argue should have done, to manage the service effectively. And there's obviously a lot of angst behind some of that and stuff. So it'd be really interesting to see what the summary decision is, and how much of that is followed through. What are you thinking there, Andy?
Yeah. I'm almost want to say, and tell us what you think about this and PSCE's service in the comments. But I think we'll probably be overwhelmed. Yeah, I do sometimes think that this is what happens when we live in a world where you get what you pay for, and perhaps you don't care about the outcome enough, so you don't value it, and you don't pay whoever's doing it, whether it's in-house or out of house, enough to do it right. That's, I don't know enough about the issue to really know what's been happening with PSCE and Capita, but I do think that that's a principle that might hold true. I do hope that whatever emerges from this will be better than the current situation. I'm not sure that it will be, but equally, it might be an improvement, and actually some of the thinking behind this might generate an improvement in the service that we see. I will watch and wait.
And I think we will have to watch and wait and see because obviously the contract is not due for renewal until 2025. That suggests that the procurement process will probably start in 2024 formally. So it'll be interesting to see how that moves forward. So this isn't a new story for today. This is a new story for the future. But I think if you wanted to have your say in it, this may be the time to start doing so, to be honest. So whether the GEPC will be taking that forward, I would hope so. At least representing the view of general practice in terms of who should be managing these services in the future. But whether this will feed into the contract negotiations, which are obviously ongoing at this point in time, it'll be really interesting to see as well. So I think at this point, it'd be worth us taking some comments and questions from our audience. We've got one more topic we are going to cover just to finish off, but actually we would love to hear your comments and questions. We've had a couple come through. So let's have a look, see. So we asked the question about people coming in to talk to us about the GMC indemnity stuff. So random Facebook user, yes, please do. Charlie Massey would be great to come and explain the reasoning. So for those that don't know who Charlie Massey is, I think apologies if I get his actual title wrong, but he's the CEO of the GMC, or the chair of the GM, whatever, the head person effectively. And I suspect some of this speaks to obviously the recent summary decisions that the GMC have made around various different cases, including how this will impact non-English trained doctors in particular. There's been lots of stuff around that. We've covered those before. We've covered the laptop gate saga. There's been various other things that have happened, and unfortunately there does tend to be a trend around non-white colleagues being more of a victim in that sense. So people are asking, is the GMC racist? We don't know, but there does seem to be some growing information that tends in the wrong direction, I guess, in that sense. So having Charlie Massey on, I guess this is our opportunity to offer an open invite. If he does want to come on and explain stuff to the general practice audience and stuff, we will be more than happy to do so. We'll see if he ever takes us up on that. I know you started another comment, Andy, so let's have a look at that one. It's seriously worrying as essentially we have no defense when complaints occur. Should we be videoing every consultation? So I guess this is in response to the GMC story about complaints and stuff. What do you think about videoing every consultation, Andy?
So all sorts of issues around consent and management of that data, because it will be really, really, really sensitive data around patients. It's an interesting suggestion. We've started to have conversations about, should we record, first of all, our reception interactions with patients, both ingoing and outgoing calls, as a way for the practice to, defend against complaints. It's something we don't do at the moment, but some practices do, I think. I suspect we might end up there. I mean, patients do sometimes video consultations themselves, don't they? So that's, it's just interesting to acknowledge that videoing of consultations with that record held by the patient does happen. And actually, it's established now that every patient could do that. The guidance is that we don't tell them to stop, that we ask for a copy of the recording. And obviously, if we feel uncomfortable, then, we might, suggest, I guess, as we can, that they see someone else. I'm not sure. But I think the general advice is that we tolerate recording. Should we record for our purposes, I guess, is the question here. I think this sort of thing, it's a bit like asking for, improved documentation. I think for it to be very clear on a recording that, you're doing everything that might possibly be required to be defensible, even though you might be doing these things quickly, in your own head and covering those bases and making quick observations, to actually do it to a standard where, the majority of, colleagues or GMC assessors would watch it and deem that it was, that you would be confident that it would be safe. I think it would extend consulting time, I guess, is where I'm going with this, Gandhi.
Yeah.
So it's the sort of thing I think clinicians would probably, they may be happy to do that, but I think there would have to be an acknowledgement that for it to be, you know, absolutely visibly clear on a recording that everything has been done, you know, in an absolutely ultimately defensible way, will take more time. I don't know. What do you think, Andy?
Well, I mean, the issue of video recording is the data storage side of it, because like you say,
Yeah.
sensitive data, but also the volume of data that you would have when you record every single
Mm.
consultation. We're talking terabytes of information for individual practices to have to maintain, process and stuff. And let's be honest, it just isn't the resources to do that. The consent aspect, and what do you do when a patient declines consent? Then how does that impact the consultation? If your policy is that you do record consultations and things from that point of view, we do record the phone consultations in the practice, and we have found that a really sensible way of managing both quality of consultations but also complaints as well, because it gives you an accurate record. And you know, sometimes things are down to tone, context and stuff, and not necessarily the words that were used and things. So important to hear some of that, which can obviously make it more appropriate and things. Really interesting comment from S. Parsons. Automated dictation is coming using AI transcripts.
Yeah.
So, you know, how AI will change things. Actually, this is a possibility. There is some data governance stuff that needs to be looked at. And it's, again, it's something that we talked about in the transcription episodes with one of the recent companies, Crescendo, talking about digital dictation, that kind of stuff. And this is now possible. There's just some licensing and IG stuff that needs to be figured out. But there's absolutely the option of using AI to summarize a consultation with a microphone on, and therefore you've got contemporaneous notes of the consultation that can be adjusted if parts are not correct, like we've talked about with using ChatGPT for the various other kind of stuff and things. But very clear, not advocating for the use of ChatGPT in general practice currently. But there are tools that may be able to help us coming around the corner. Are they enough? Are they appropriate? Well, time will tell us, I think, from that point of view. But definitely dictation is one, I think, that will be an interesting one to help.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting that you record the clinical conversations. I think our local out of hours providers do that and do some quality audits routinely on those, which I think is really interesting exercise. And I do think we'll probably move to a world where this is more commonplace. But we don't do it currently, and I don't know if the majority of places would do. But yeah, interesting, very interesting question.
Potentially. I guess another comment. So we talked about the EMIS outage and stuff. So Andrew Lloyd, I'm assuming it's not Andrew Lloyd Webber. That'd be awesome if it was. We are reviewing our contract with EMIS, looking at new providers. And I guess that's something that people are now contemplating with the new entrants coming towards the market. That does give more options compared to, I guess, currently what's predominantly used in the UK, which is EMIS or System 1. There is Vision, I guess, as an alternative service provider. But there are new entrants coming to the market. It'll be interesting to see how people move forward with changes, because I know that how the current systems are working do a job. Could they do a better job? I think the gulf between consumer tech and primary care tech is growing. And that has an impact in terms of, I think, what people want out of the tech they use. Absolutely, the user experience, from my perspective, needs to change from both systems. And I think that's something that really would be more effective if it was a more modernized element of primary care, because that would just massively change the productivity and obviously the workload that we then face as a result of it. That's my personal view. But what systems people will go to, absolutely their own choice and stuff.
Interesting world. So should we move on to our final story, Gandhi?
Absolutely. So just to so the reason why we're covering this now is because it's a breaking story. It's literally just come out in the past hour or so. So we've not had a great deal of time to digest it, but it's a comment made by HealthWatch following a recent report that they published about the potential for over-the-counter medications being available on prescription in deprived situations and stuff. Do you want to lead us through the story, Andy?
Yeah, so HealthWatch have published a report, and I think we're going to look at that report in a separate episode. So look out for a link to that, and look out for that coming up in the next few weeks. So HealthWatch England are the body that work for patient advocacy. So if you're doing work at your practice or your primary care networks or at place, you will often see the HealthWatch, sort of the chair of the local HealthWatch group, or a HealthWatch representative, and they often come and they advocate for patients in meetings and at that level. So that's what HealthWatch is, and they're not a body who are able to change our contracts, and they're not suggesting this is contractual changes, and these are not clinical guidelines, but these are suggestions in a report that they have published from the perspective of patient well-being. So that's just outlining who Healthwatch are. The content of the report, if you want to pop it back on screen. So Pulse, friends of the podcast, provide a very good article on this, and they summarize the report's recommendations in a helpful little table down here. And actually, they are suggesting that guidance should encourage GPs to offer people over-the-counter medications on prescription based on socioeconomic grounds. And then there's other recommendations, which I guess we might look at either later in the other episodes, that are less directly focused on general practice, but this really is focused on GPs. I mean, this has been an interesting issue over the years. I think it's something that there wasn't really guidance or discussion about many years ago. And I think individual GPs would sometimes do this. They sometimes wouldn't. What we're talking about, things like paracetamol for fever and for pain relief, perhaps hay fever medications, antihistamines that people can go and buy fairly affordably from a pharmacy, but for certain categories of patients who are eligible for free prescriptions, and often that is people who are in a socioeconomic situation where they can't afford these things. Perhaps they're in receipt of benefit, or they have a disability or other qualifying condition. Then they get free prescriptions. So if they went to the shop to buy their antihistamine for hay fever, they would have to pay the pharmacist or the pharmacy for that product. But if they were to go to their GP and they were to get a prescription for that, then they could take that prescription to the pharmacy and be issued that same product for free or no cost to them. Obviously, there's a cost to the system. And then there was a move. So from about 2018 onwards, there was a real move within the NHS to move away from this, saying that this wasted clinician time, that seeing a GP for 10 minutes to get a prescription of an antihistamine that cost pennies from the pharmacy was not a great use of resources for the system, that this shouldn't happen anymore. So we were encouraged to not indulge these requests. And actually, there were many schemes around the country that enabled pharmacists to provide these simple medications free of charge to people in these socioeconomic groups. It's called Pharmacy First in our area. And worryingly, that's something that's actually been cut within the last few months, leading to, certainly at my practice, an uptick and an increase in patients coming asking for simple over-the-counter medicine during GP consultations, which is meaning that other people who want to see us about other issues are less able to do so. So it's a really big issue, and it's an interesting position for Healthwatch to be saying that they encourage GPs, and I guess by implication the whole activity of GPs prescribing these sorts of medicines on prescription. Hopefully I've outlined that fairly well. Anything you want to add to the outline, Gandhi? And I'm interested to know what your reaction to this is.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting perspective, because it's taking the view, like you say, of moving away from self-care, but it's compounding that with the concept that actually some people just cannot afford to self-care themselves, and how much of an issue should that play, and where does that line sit when it comes to deprivation being a factor, because actually some of that is also potentially choice. I wonder, and obviously we've not looked through the document yet, but how much of that plays an impact in terms of the cost, not only to the individual patient, obviously be cheaper, but actually the cost to the system, like you mentioned, the cost of a GP appointment, the cost of a pharmacist processing that prescription. That's all work that then is taken up by potentially somebody taking self-care routes themselves. But if they can't afford it, that's a compounding issue, because potentially they may not access that health need, and then it gets worse, or it has an impact on another healthcare aspect of them, and that makes that worse, potentially, the comorbidity. So therefore, does that therefore make that person more unwell, unable to do certain things, for example, unable to work, unable to care for another individual? And I think that's some of the stuff the report looks at in terms of the impact it has on some of the system. But we're really keen to know how much of the system it actually looks at, because let's be honest, the cost of a GP consultation is approximately £30 to £40 for a 10-minute consultation. If you look at the PSSRU data on regular basis over the past few years, that's a significant cost to the system for something that a patient could have obtained for a couple of quid at the most for most of these over-the-counter medications and stuff. It does also raise the question about the prescription payment services. Obviously, England is different to Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland in terms of how it charges for prescriptions. So Scotland and Wales don't charge anything for anybody, whereas in England, if you're over 18 and under 60, unless you've got an exemption, you will be paying for your prescriptions. So, how does that have an impact on the way that we access healthcare on those chronic health conditions? I've had patients who cannot afford their regular medications because they just can't afford them, but they don't qualify for free prescriptions because they're trying to do other things like trying to work, trying to do it, and not claim benefits for whatever reason that may be, and therefore their health deteriorates as a result of it. So it is an issue. How you solve that issue, so much more complicated. Enabling better access to medications obviously would have some impact, but is the answer that they should be available on prescription by the GP, by the practice team and stuff? I don't know if I'm happy with that one, because I know that's going to increase the demand coming to us, and at a time where demand is already beyond capacity, and actually it takes away that self-care message. So I think there needs to be another mechanism for making that happen for those deprived patients. But again, I can't comment on what that other mechanism would be at this point. The report does make obviously other medication recommendations as well, though.
It does, and I think an interesting one is actually just looking at so actually the report, I think, does recognise that deprivation isn't just something that GPs can solve by prescribing their over-the-counter medicines. There are lots of other factors, and actually I think they place a lot of emphasis on the government to solve these affordability issues for patients. They make some recommendations or some comments about access to broadband digital services as well, which I'm not going to go into sort of detail here, but just serves to highlight that an upcoming episode we will be doing will be focused on the issue of digital exclusion, health inequality, and where those two interact in digital health inequalities, and that'll be an interesting episode for people to watch, where I guess we'll dive into these sorts of issues in a bit more detail. So I guess that might bring us towards the end of today's episode, Gandhi. We're getting towards the end of the Google Doc here. Anything you wanted to add? Any further comments coming through?
Well, we just had one from Dave. Are we planning on recovering the checklist for delivery plan for recovering access to general practice? Have we missed it? Potentially, Dave. We've covered the recovery plan in quite a lot of detail on some of the other streams and stuff. So do check those out. If there's a particular question you've still got from that, feel free to contact us and things. I think we have covered that in quite a lot of detail in some of the previous streams and stuff. Andrew Lloyd commenting that if I had £1 for every time I heard that, I could fund general practice. I'm guessing that's my quip about Andrew Lloyd Webber and stuff. But glad to hear that I was taken in jest, because it was meant to be as a fun thing. So not meant as anything else from there. Andy mentioned about us covering the report in more detail. Absolutely, we'll be doing that. So if you want to check out our review of that Health Watch report, check out this episode coming up right here. Alternately, if you want to know more about deprivation and impact, particularly from a digital perspective, check out our upcoming episode coming up right here. And as always, we're here to help tech enhance your primary care and learning. We will catch you in the next episode. See you later.